I'm gonna kick us off. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. It's just after 2:30 p.m. Eastern, so we'll go ahead and get started. As I noted, welcome to the June COVID Information Commons Research Webinar. My name is Lauren Close. I'm the Operations and Communications Manager for the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub here at Columbia University. The COVID Info Commons, or KIC, is a COVID-19 research collaboration platform brought to you by the Big Data Innovation Hubs and funded by the National Science Foundation's Convergence Accelerator. Every month, the KIC brings together scholars from across the country to share their research findings in the form of lightning talks. Each scholar will engage the community directly, answering your questions about their work during a Q&A session at the end of our presentations. I should note that we at the KIC are committed to providing a supportive and welcoming environment to everybody who works, studies, and interacts with the Hub community at public events. So we encourage you to review our code of conduct for online programs on the Hub website. And this includes information about reporting, accessibility features, and we will drop a link to that resource in the chat shortly. And before I hand you over to today's truly fantastic group of speakers and open up this second event in our series on COVID-19 and behavioral and social sciences, I want to first introduce you to the rest of the KIC project team. Today, we are joined by the Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub's Executive Director, Florence Hudson, and our program coordinator for the National Student Data Corps, Emily Rothenberg. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Florence, who's going to say a bit more about the KIC and just a few announcements about our upcoming programs and opportunities.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for always doing a great job getting us all set, kicking us off, and hosting us. And we're really delighted that everyone has been able to join us today, both the presenters and the participants, because this is a very collaborative environment. So the COVID Information Commons started in 2020 when NSF contacted us at the Northeast Big Data Hub and said, could you put together, a portal so we can find all of these NSF-funded COVID awards? And we said, sure, rapid award, we'll give you the money quick. So at the time I went into the NSF Simple Search and there were only 32 awards. Now we have almost 2,000 in the corpus. I know, right? That's how I felt too. So we had to build a bigger system. So we have evolved this over time, and we're very fortunate that NSF asked us last year if they gave us $2 million more, if we could do this for 4 more years. And of course, what we all say is absolutely, we're honored to do that and we're delighted. And so we got the KIC Extension Award in October of 2021 that goes through September of 2025. And as part of that, we're making a couple of cool updates. One is actually this month, it's in internal test right now. We are adding NIH awards, COVID-related awards into the corpus and the database so that you'll be able to do keyword searches across NSF and NIH COVID-related awards and find collaborative research opportunities. We currently have about 2,000 NSF awards. We're expecting we'll be bringing in about 3,000 or 4,000 NIH awards, and that changes over time. What we're also going to be doing then next year is creating a new metadata and data search and discovery mechanism, because currently what we have, if you go to the KIC website, which is covidinfocommons.net, under opportunities and resources, you can get to about 50 different data sets that are COVID related that we vetted around the world. Currently, when you put a keyword search in, like in the Search NSF COVID Awards and PI database, it just goes against the corpus of the NSF awards. We want our new tool to be able to crawl across all those other data sets that we've identified so that you can find pertinent research information and data sets related to your area of research or area of focus, or as a citizen scientist. We also have this cool tool, this COVID Research Explorer ML Maps tool, and it's built on a facility called Lingo4G from a company named Carrot Search in Poland. And that allows you to see clustered nuances of the awards in the database. Currently, it only goes against the rapid awards. That's what NSF asked us to do first. And we're looking to expand that to all the NSF COVID awards and the NIH awards in the next few months. So we're very excited about the opportunity to work with all of you and to bring you all these different functions. You'll be hearing about more things from Lauren that we're planning as well.
Yes, thank you, Florence. I wanted to also show this slide since you alluded to the work that we're doing now with our Extension Award. We're really excited to be expanding the searchable awards in our database. And so keep an eye out for new developments and innovations as we build up this space. So thank you for that. Finally, I will just mention briefly that the KIC and the NEBG Hub has started a new accessibility initiative this year. As I briefly noted at the top of the hour, we're working with Columbia University Libraries to make the content of these webinars accessible to a broader audience. So with the help of our staff, students, volunteers, we're in the process of actually transcribing each of these monthly webinars. So individuals with various accessibility needs can also access this research rather than just listen. You can also read it or watch it. We're translating these texts into Spanish as well, which will help us reach an even broader community. So you can learn more about the Hub's accessibility and DEIA initiatives on our website. Also, if you're interested in helping our team build out these accessibility features further, please do reach out to us. Emily is going to drop some information about this program into the chat. But without any further ado, I want to begin today's webinar on COVID-19 and the behavioral and social sciences. So this afternoon, we'll be hearing from 4 fantastic sets of researchers on their most recent projects funded by NSF. We have Jennifer Hamilton and her colleague Debbie Kim at NORC, which is at the University of Chicago, Brandon Johnson at the Decision Research Institute, Amit and Valerie, who are going to be presenting from the University of South Carolina and Wright State. And finally, Natalie Shook, who's coming to us from the University of Connecticut. So I'm going to stop talking and I'll kick off this afternoon's webinar by introducing our first speaker, Jennifer Hamilton. So let me stop my screen share and Jennifer, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I'm just going to pull up my slide deck right now and put it in the right view. And switch it over. I got to do this every time. Let's see. Swap. There we go. That's correct, right? You can see it okay? Fantastic. Thank you. So I am Jennifer Hamilton. I'm Vice President of Education at NORC at the University of Chicago. And I'm here today to talk to you about what happened to high school students when schools went virtual back in the spring of 2020. And if you're a parent, you probably have some idea of where this is going. So the big concern at the time, based on anecdotal evidence and some of what we were reading in the news, was that the COVID epidemic was disproportionately impacting poor and minority students, specifically, much harder than their counterparts. And so we wanted to investigate this and get some kind of empirical evidence as to what was going on. So what we did was we designed this study with 2 goals. The first goal was to understand what was happening. And we did this through a nationally representative survey of teens. And we did this towards the end of the spring semester in 2020, because we wanted to get their impressions of what was going on as quickly as possible. And that's goal 1, and that's what I'm going to be presenting on. Goal 2, we're still working on, and we're working here with Infinite Campus, which is a student information system. And they have data on millions and millions of high school students all across the country. And this is the first of a kind partnership where researchers have never been able to access these data before. So we're working to look at this, massive data set to try and understand what was happening right before COVID, during COVID when schools were virtual, and what's happening now right after, or kind of continuing with COVID. And so we're hoping to come back and maybe do another presentation towards the end of the year once we finish that part of the study. But going back to the survey, the goal 1 of understanding. So prior to COVID, back in the early spring of 2020, 46% of high school juniors had considered a STEM career, which is really nice. But when you look at this broken out by low income and higher income, you'll see that that's proportionally much higher, statistically significantly higher for high income students to be considering a STEM career. So this is before COVID hits. Also before COVID, when we're looking at the classes that high school students were taking, we can see that higher income students were taking more STEM classes and enrolled in more AP classes. And you can see everything with a star is statistically significant. So then during COVID, we wanted to see how this was kind of changing. We had some open-ended questions in the survey where we asked students about what was happening. And as you can see here, we had a lot of feedback about not having a laptop, not having internet, not having enough laptops for all the kids in the family, like multiple kids had to share the same laptop, not having a webcam, not having the right calculator, having a very chaotic household. I mean, we had kids talk about how they had to drive, 4 miles down the mountain to go to sit in the Dairy Queen parking lot to get Wi-Fi, all of those kinds of things. So these were all significant challenges to kids at that time. And students were worried about their education. As you can see here, over a third of students were extremely or moderately worried about their STEM education. And if you look at that broken by income, again, over to the right here, you see that the highest income, 33%, so a third of the higher income kids were not really worried. They thought they were going to be fine. But when you look at the lower income kids, that's much fewer. So only 17% thought they were going to be fine. And we also looked at the kids who were taking their AP exams. So these are some, AP exams in STEM classes. And for most classes, about 50% of students did not take the exam. Calculus was a little bit was lower. But so these are kids who are interested in math and science, signed up for AP classes, were taking AP classes, but then didn't take the tests, and that's half. But then again, when you break it out by income, you'll see a stark and very concerning difference between the higher income and the lower income kids, where 72% of the lower income kids did not take the exam compared to only 29% of the higher income kids. So you can see here that it's very clearly disproportionately affecting like these lower income kids. And I want to say here also, we talked to the College Board about this, and they did some massive outreach at this time. They waived the exam fees. They changed the exam to only cover content from the beginning of the semester. They reached out to a lot of kids and provided internet and laptops so that they would be able to take the exam. And even with this massive outreach, we still had this kind of result. So where do we go from here? So this is the million-dollar question, right? Everybody in education is trying to grapple with this. It's very clear that there are, lots of problems and kids coming off of the trajectory. And it's very concerning because these are kids that were on the right path, right? Like they were doing everything they were supposed to be doing. They were taking the AP classes, and then this kind of just knocked them off kilter. And so what we're trying to do is give some policy, guidance that's kind of around this topic. One of the primary things is prioritizing reliable access to online instruction, because, online instruction is now, I think, going to be part and parcel of education moving forward. And folks like the Bureau of Indian Education are already doing a lot of this work, like they have a lot of kids in rural areas, they're making sure everybody has MiFis and trying to make sure everybody has laptops to kind of bridge that gap. We're also advising teachers and educators to assess students early so that they can differentiate instruction moving forward, and to coordinate instruction across grades so you can do some looping backwards and kind of try to keep things moving ahead. One of the things that is really popular that folks are talking a lot about is high-dose tutoring. There's a lot of evidence in the literature to show that this is very effective. So 3 or more times a week, very small groups, 1, 2, or 3 kids per tutor, they're found is very effective in accelerating learning. So that is an option for folks. And the College Board did a study with us on this, looking at doing this virtually, because the problem with high dose tutoring, of course, is it's hard to bring it to scale when it's one-on-one, but doing it virtually with small groups had some great promise there. And there's also summer acceleration programs and extended learning time and out of school time interventions that could be useful. So that is my presentation for today, and I'm happy to take some questions. I think we're taking questions at the end, right, Lauren?
Yes, that's correct. And thank you, Jennifer. We are asking our audience to either drop questions in the chat if you have an idea, or if you want to save your question, you can unmute yourself at the very end of all the presentations today, and we'll take the questions one by one. And yes, Brandon, anticipating my next move, I was going to welcome Brandon to be our second speaker for today. He's going to be coming to us this afternoon from Decision Research Institute. Welcome, Brandon.
Your slides look great. You just have to unmute and you can get started.
Okay, so to start with the methodological stuff, the critical information here is this is a longitudinal panel design with an American sample. It included 6 waves across 14 months at roughly 2-month intervals, and that, in contrast to some other longitudinal work, including my own on Ebola and Zika, almost all of our measures were repeated each wave, which gave us a much greater granularity.
Excuse me, Brandon, can I just ask you to go back to your title slide and give everybody the context of your research, please?
The
media exposure, just so people know what your topic is, please.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. In my first talk in this series, I presented some results on how threat, stakeholder, and protective behavior attributes affected behavioral intentions out of this protective action decision model I cite here, as well as some initial work on the interaction of political ideology, conspiracist thinking, and prejudice on intentions to avoid Asians as a so-called protective behavior. What I'm going to be doing today is focusing on risk perception variation across time. So we had 3 research questions of interest for today's talk. One is just how do different kinds of risk perception measures of COVID cluster and vary over time. Secondly, we were focusing on relations between risk perceptions and self-protective behaviors. One hypothesis is that high risk perception at one time predicts high protective behavior at a future time. High protective behavior at one time predicts lower risk perceptions at a future time. And then this accuracy hypothesis that they're correlated cross-sectionally. And unfortunately, since most studies are cross-sectional, sometimes they're assuming, for example, that their accuracy measurements are assessing the behavioral motivation hypothesis. And then finally, I wanted to look at temporal dynamics of predictors of risk perception over time. Previous research I'd done suggested that there were some commonalities across infectious disease incidents. So I wanted to see what might happen here. So first, with regard to the clustering of risk perception measures, as you can see here, we had a quite a heterogeneous set of measures. So one would assume that they're probably not all going to cluster together. But we did have some surprises. For example, affect, which is sort of a general good, bad feeling measure, did not cluster with other affective measures we had. Also, duration, how long do you think this outbreak is going to last in the US, did not cluster with other, what we referred to as national severity measures, such as how many infections or deaths do you expect to happen. And again, I want to emphasize that we asked these questions at each one of the 6 waves, so we could look at variation across time. So here is a plot of how those measures varied. The severity and duration measures were only collected starting at wave 2, which is the late April, early May 2020 survey. And what you can see here is that the first wave, which was very early in the US experience, February 28th, when, depending on which database you use, either 17 or 45 cases of infection had been officially confirmed, that this is an outlier. And I won't go into details, but measures of association between risk perceptions and behavioral intentions and policy support and so forth also appear to be different at this very early stage of the experience than later. Once we get out of wave 1, we see that, well, in general, there's a similar pattern, but we do see some differences across these different risk perception measures in the slope of these measures across time. With regard to the risk perception behavior associations from the Brewer et al. Paper, we found that behavioral motivation was strongly supported across waves, that people who saw stronger risk at one point were reporting higher protective behavior at a later point. This is somewhat in contrast with the prior literature out of some 540 or so citations to Brewer et al. We found 17 that had actually done some empirical work, and they had mixed results overall on this hypothesis. There is a wider debate in the field about this risk perception paradox, that people sometimes seem not to act even though they see high risk. And I'm throwing out here the possibility that this partly reflects cross-sectional surveys, which, as I said before, cannot test the behavioral motivation hypothesis. The risk reappraisal hypothesis, by contrast, we saw no evidence of that here. That in contrast, we found that if people were reporting relatively high protective behavior at one point, their risk perceptions were going up at future points, which is consistent with prior studies. I mean, is not consistent with prior studies that did find that risk reappraisal occurred. We suspect this is possibly because we were dealing with an infectious disease, which is quite dynamic, as opposed to previous studies that were mostly focusing on chronic diseases or cancer or things like that. But obviously we can't test that speculation here. Then finally, with the accuracy hypothesis. We generally found results consistent with that, and it was consistent with prior literature. But we did find a few positive associations in that high risk perception and high protective behavior were associated at a single time. Now, Brewer et al., in fact, said that you could find negative, positive, or non-associations in accuracy tests. And so we're not inconsistent with their work, but they didn't explain in sufficient detail, in my mind, why this variation might occur, except that, for example, protective actions might not be seen as effective by people. So I think we need more work there. Now for the last one, we're looking at temporal changes in risk perception over time. And for brevity, I'm just going to focus on personal risk. We found somewhat different patterns for other risk perception measures. And so on the left, I'm showing personal risk perception patterns for trust in the World Health Organization on the top and temporal distance at the bottom. And we find for both of these that over time, with the solid line indicating the first wave at 0 weeks and the regular dotted line indicating the last wave at 56 weeks, that we find that the difference increases over time between people who are high versus low in either trust in WHO or the perception that COVID will be local or is local now, as opposed to sometime later. By contrast, we see with the upper right that the difference decreases over time between people high versus low in social distance. That is, whether COVID affected people seem to be like me or unlike me. And then finally, although the effect is not strong here or in any of our other measures that show this pattern, we found that the difference between high and low people, in this case on the trend in risk, so this is an objective measure of the number of infectious cases in the county of the respondent, we find that the difference shifts from a positive to a slightly negative association over time. And I won't go into more detail here, except to say this is one of our current challenges, is try to find a theoretical foundation for understanding why these particular patterns occur. This was the model that was in our original RAPID proposal. It didn't entirely reflect our thinking at the time because we didn't have enough space on the page to put it down, and we've thrown in a few extra measures as we progressed. But I'm just putting it here first to show that on the right-hand side of the page is the protective action decision model based approach, and to show that we've got a number of other things we're doing. For example, we're engaged now in doing some content analyses of legacy and social media to see how they might affect downstream results. So we've got plenty more work to do. And finally, my acknowledgements and contact. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. And it's very interesting you mentioned social media at the end, because I think that provides a really nice transition to our next two speakers, Valerie Shalin and Amit Sheth, who are going to be speaking to us about their recent work as well. I think, Amit, you should be able to share your screen. We can see your screen, Amit, but we cannot hear you.
Your Zoom needs to be unmuted and maybe your computer. Sometimes people are double muted. Oh,
Okay, can you hear me?
You know
excellent.
why? You know why? Because he's logged in as me and I was muted.
Okay, all right. So we were to discuss our analysis of public health issues when we analyze very large amount of social media content. The focus is on mental health and addiction related analysis and what we call social quality of index. AI Institute of University of South Carolina, Rice State University, Georgia State Universities are participants or the members for the team belong to these. So we all know of the massive impact of this pandemic. And this has also resulted in a significant impact on depression, anxiety, other mental health issues, on addictions and substance abuse. So we said, well, can we understand how various policy decisions, social, economic, public health policies, and the choices that government and policymakers have made affect the well-being of society, members of the society. And our toolbox is knowledge enhanced social media analysis. So we position it as the following. We capture the data between the period, as you see here, March 2020 and end of January 2021, that covered two major COVID-19 waves. We had 25 correlating terms. We collected 12 billion tweets. In addition to this data, we had a lot of other data to be used. And that is a very important methodical part of the study, because it's not just analyzing social media data is not enough. You need a lot of other relevant information to be able to analyze the data. So we had location related information. We looked at specific subreddits to train our language models. And we had mental health related knowledge bases, DSM-5, drug abuse ontology, DBpedia, Wikidata, UMLS. Additionally, we had to look at on the ground events. For example, loan relief, household income relief, testing policy, all those things that, all those choices that various state leaders made or federal, policymakers made. So we need to also have understanding of what happened, when and where. And there were other events that also we have to understand. Our focus was on understanding the content on social media related to mental health. So you can see some examples here. We developed an empirical measure we call social quality index, and it aggregates mental health components and addiction and substance use disorder components, right? So analyzing the social media data for these components to come up with social quality index. There is a pretty comprehensive infrastructure, as analysis of this kind is pretty daunting. So you have Twitter data, but you have news article. I'll quickly mention why we have news article. You have various knowledge base. And then you have to do a whole variety of analysis. You can see there in the second vertical box. Then it goes to language models and topic models, semantic mappings, so deeper understanding. And our team works on knowledge infused learning. So we have a particular enhanced deep learning methods to that uses knowledge of the domain to better understand the language. From there on, to understand content related to depression, anxiety, addiction, substance use, all in the context of COVID, leading to SQI calculations. There were language model training component and all those that are not shown here in this picture. So what are the innovations? We use news to continuously identify new entities of interest related to COVID. And in this context, we use location extractions using geonames, OpenStreetMap, and other things. We use multiple vocabularies and knowledge graph for semantic extraction. We use specialized subreddit corpus for language model training and topic models. And we train classifiers to scale the analysis of big data. So we couldn't do the analysis. To analyze such large amount of data, we had to create these classifiers and then understand depression, addiction, anxiety, and other issues. With that background, I'm going to pass on to Valerie to explain what we found.
Thank you, Amit. Let me give you an idea of the kind of analyses that become possible with the kind of capabilities that Amit just described. So here are some sample state graphs of COVID rates and SQI over time. Like Brandon, we think time is absolutely the issue here. So COVID rates per capita is on the left y-axis and SQI is on the right axis. Up is bad, down is good. Time is on the x-axis, and there's a discontinuity there marked with the hash marks. And I'm not expecting you to read these graphs carefully, except that you'll certainly notice that there's very little correlation between the social quality index that we've identified and COVID prevalence. There is one place, whoops, back one bit on it just for a second. There is one place that you'll notice a correlation. And that is towards the end. And we think that that is likely reflecting a latent variable. That is the holiday season. That's the winter holiday season. And so probably what's going on is that the winter holidays are increasing both COVID rates. And we already know that the winter holidays are very challenging for mental health. So that makes a lot of good sense. And it serves as an informal validation of the SQI metric. Next slide.
No, I can't advance, so I don't know what. Lauren, I can't advance.
Let's see. I may be able to share on your behalf. Hang on.
Did you try just clicking on the slide or using the up or down arrows? Did you try a few different options?
Okay.
There you go. Okay. It's working.
Yay, okay. So one of the points that we want to make is that the holidays, of course, are not the only event that we can now examine. And this is a graph for the state of Washington. And what we're showing you there is the policy changes that we've identified in news aligned with the various periods that we have marked out there with the vertical lines. So our point is that it's now possible to look for patterns relating this social quality index to the implementation of policy by state. Next slide, Amit. So SQI is a standardized measure. It's independent of state population or amount of social media activity. And because it's standardized in that way, we can compare states. And we've done, next slide, some state clustering to see if we can discern patterns. And you see that Connecticut, Louisiana, New Jersey, Nevada, et cetera, all seem to be following the same kind of pattern. SQI is bad at the beginning, it gets better and then gets worse. This is for a truncated high resolution time period. And then a different cluster, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, et cetera, have an SQI better, SQI worse pattern. So we can reveal some of these patterns over time. Of course, we have to do more longitudinal and time series analyses to pull out the potential causes. But it does look to us like it's the economic issues that are going to be the major factor here. Next slide. So what is now possible with the tools that the South Carolina team has developed? We have a knowledge-driven analysis of social media at an abstract level, and it provides a very high-resolution data set, both with respect to time and space. It is rapid. And it provides separable measures of mental health that are not feasible in survey metrics. We can get lots and lots of data spread out over large portions of space and time. And that's the kind of data that you need in order to pull out the confounds and begin to evaluate whether or not your policy decisions were having an effect on your population. So this is a really important research tool that advances our capabilities in science. But more broadly, it enables real-time monitoring and preparation for mitigation. And of course, it supports policymakers in general. And that is our presentation for you.
Thank you to both Amit and Valerie. That was very interesting. I want to say a brief reminder to our audience to please either share your questions in the chat or hang on to that for our moderated Q&A session at the end. Given the insights we've heard from our first 3 presentations, I'm sure this will be a very active Q&A session, so we're looking forward to that. But first, I want to turn the webinar over to our final speaker for today, Natalie Shook, who is at the University of Connecticut.
All right, thank you so much. So yeah, I want to share some of the work that I've been doing in my lab, specifically looking at psychological well-being. So it nicely segues from the previous speakers. So we have lots of reports that through the pandemic, individuals have been impacted as far as their mental health, as far as just self-reports about greater distress during the pandemic, to higher prevalence rates of depression and anxiety. And some of the work that I've done where we've actually been able to, assess people and compare their depression and anxiety and stress levels to their pre-pandemic levels. And we've seen significant increases. But people have experienced the pandemic and been affected by it differently. And so what we've been focusing on is really to think about how groups may differ as far as the psychological consequences. And one distinction we've been focusing on is to think about different age groups. And so what got us sort of started on this is thinking about older adults who are at higher risk for severe illness, hospitalization, higher mortality rates. And so with that, then, does this place them as far as with this disease risk at maybe a worse position as far as thinking about the impact the pandemic is having on their psychological well-being? So we could see greater levels of depression and anxiety in our older population. Alternatively, that might not be the case. Mm-hmm. So what we know prior to the pandemic, with age, we generally have better psychological well-being on average. And there's a phenomenon, the well-being paradox, in which, although there are many negative things that come with aging, as far as thinking about health declines, loss of loved ones, we see this better emotional and psychological well-being. So alternatively, with the pandemic, we may not see, like I said, as much of an impact or as great of an impact in our older population. So we took the project that we were doing, funded through NSF, to really try and tease this apart and look at potential age differences. So we recruited a national sample of US adults through Qualtrics. And we had a relatively equal number of different age groups. So we have our younger, middle-aged, and older adults. And we surveyed them across time, but I'm going to focus in on sort of our initial surveys early in the pandemic, where we were seeing higher levels of depression and anxiety. And so as part of our survey, we had the patient health questionnaire for depression and generalized anxiety disorder 7 for our anxiety measure. And on average, like others, we did find higher levels of depression and anxiety, significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels. But there were differences across the age span. So our older adults were reporting less depression and anxiety than our younger adults. And so to give you a visual of kind of the breakdown of this, what I have here on the x-axis, we have our degree or severity of depression and anxiety symptoms. Our white dotted bars are younger adults, our striped bars are middle-aged adults, and our gray bars are our older adults. And the bars are simply the proportion in each age group that fell into these different severity categories. So what you'll see for our older adults, about 70% were reporting minimal to no symptoms of depression or anxiety, as compared to our younger adults who are just under 40. I think I might have said that wrong. Sorry, just under 40% in our younger adults. So we see this big difference as far as thinking about the breakdown. And it really is our younger and middle-aged adults who are driving then those higher rates of depression and anxiety that we were seeing in our sample. So to add to this then, what stood out within our sample, older adults were more concerned about COVID. So they were more worried about COVID, but we weren't seeing higher levels of depression and anxiety. Particularly, this stood out to us when we look at the association between COVID concerns and mental health. Those who thought they were more likely to contract COVID were reporting greater anxiety. But like I said, we weren't seeing that come out when we broke it down by age. So when we looked at that moderation, and so here on the y-axis, we have anxiety, x-axis, we have perceived likelihood of contracting COVID. For our younger participants with the dotted line, we have that positive association. The greater the likelihood that I'm going to contract into COVID, the more anxious I am. But for our older participants, that solid line, we saw no significant association. So despite this heightened concern, that wasn't then, I said, sort of translating to greater anxiety. And some of this we think is probably due to thinking about that well-being paradox. As we get older, we're better able to regulate our emotions. We have better coping strategies. We've been through more stressors. And so we maybe have some greater resilience with age. And so we're not seeing those negative or as great of impact as far as psychological well-being. To expand on this, then, we started to also think about the different pandemic-related stressors and what are the factors that are contributing to declines in depression, or increases in depression and anxiety. And so beyond our concern about COVID, disease threat, there is social isolation with self-quarantining, working and schooling from home, less social contact that generally has negative consequences for our mental health. A lot of financial, economic concerns, job, food insecurity, disruption to daily life, we weren't able to do, and many of us are still not doing the things we normally would do on a day-to-day basis. And all of these things affect our psychological well-being. So what we wanted to do is really think about these simultaneously to tease apart what are the stressors that really seem to be driving anxiety and depression. So with the sample that we had previously surveyed, we actually looked at a subsample, specifically looking at participants who had indicated some level of employment. So we kind of took out our retirees and students, basically, so that we could look at job insecurity. And we surveyed these individuals early to mid-April. So again, still early in the pandemic where we were seeing particularly heightened depression and anxiety levels. We had our same measures of depression, anxiety, and then, like I said, we assessed a variety of different pandemic stressors, from simple concern and worry about COVID, job insecurity, financial concerns, social distancing, self-quarantining, disruption to daily life. And then we also asked about how much they were following news coverage of COVID. Now, at a bivariate level, if we just look at each of those stressors in relation to depression and anxiety, and I'm going to zero in your attention to this section of the table. So in column 1 and 2 here, we've got our anxiety and depression levels. All of our stressors, except for social distancing, were significantly associated with worse mental health. right? So the more concerned you were about finances, your job, the more concerned you were about COVID, the more you were following news coverage and self-quarantining, the greater your depression and anxiety. What I will highlight, and similar to what Valerie was saying, a few of these are particularly, thinking about the effects are much stronger. So financial concern, job insecurity, perceived likelihood of contracting COVID were sort of more the stronger effects. Now, beyond the bivariate association, because we're not just experiencing one of these stressors, we have a lot of these going on all at once. So we wanted to know, if we consider these simultaneously, which are the stressors that really stand out as being related to anxiety and depression. So we ran some regression models, and we controlled for a number of different demographics and participant health status. And what we saw when we took all of the stressors into account at once with regard to anxiety, the stressors that were significant and stood out, that perceived likelihood of infection, if you were watching more news about COVID, and financial concerns were the strongest predictors. For depression, so we have this kind of odd negative association with the extent to which we're following news. That may be a suppression effect, or it may be some indication of behavioral activation. If people were if you're less depressed and more engaged, maybe you were engaging with this material more. But we did see that job insecurity, the more worried you were about your job, the higher your depression levels. So with this, as others have pointed out, we are seeing significant impact on psychological health stemming from and during the pandemic. But groups are experiencing this differently. Within our sample, we saw that our older participants were faring better, not to say that they were unaffected by any means, but compared to younger adults, we weren't seeing the levels of anxiety and depression. And those pandemic stressors, there are a variety of them, but certain ones stood out as being particularly concerning: financial concerns, job insecurity, that perceived likelihood of infection. So moving forward, and what we're kind of focusing on now is taking this information and looking at the time course of psychological well-being across the pandemic and how that maps on to changes in those stressors and to what extent those patterns differ across groups. Looking at age, but we're also doing quite a bit looking at racial and ethnic groups that have been affected very differently. And the importance of doing that, looking at this group by stressor interaction as far as developing interventions, targeted interventions to really speak to what are the most prevalent and salient stressors and how can we provide support to reduce that and improve psychological well-being. So thank you to NSF, and thank you to my graduate students for all of their help, and thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. That was so great, Natalie. Thank you for sharing your research with our audience. So I think it's now time for me to say that we're concluding this series of presentations. I want to thank everyone for talking a bit about your research today. We've received a bunch of different unique insights on the latest COVID-19 research, and we're so excited to be able to share this portfolio of NSF projects with our audience. So for the audience, I want to say that each of our speakers' presentations will obviously also be made available on our website and on our YouTube channel later this week. If you need to go back in and find those key details, you can watch it at your leisure at a later time. And of course, as we noted earlier, these presentations will also be given additional accessibility features like the English and Spanish transcripts. So please absorb them in all the different ways that you prefer. And I'm going to just share my screen very, very quickly before we head over into today's Q&A session. I want to share this information with our audience, and I want to encourage everyone to take advantage of the numerous ways that you can remain engaged with the COVID Information Commons community. So please check out our website. You can subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Slack, LinkedIn. If you have any questions or suggestions for our events, please send us an email. We're always happy to hear from you. We'll be sharing the details from this slide directly in the chat, so please peruse all of them at your own pace. And we do want to hear from you, our community, so please reach out. To that end, I will mention that when we close out our Zoom webinar today, you will see a little pop-up survey on your screen. Please consider taking this survey. It helps us improve our webinar. We do want to hear from you, and we're always trying to improve our events programming. And then I'm going to drop in here a quick teaser for our July 2022 KIC webinar. This is our list of our researchers and the ones you can expect to hear from during our next event, which is on the Friday, 15th of July. Please take a moment to register if you're interested in joining, and we will be sharing a link to that in the chat below as well. So that's enough of my PSAs. I will stop sharing my screen. And I think we're ready at this stage to open it up to Q&A from our audience. We've collected a couple Q&As from the chat box, so thank you for all of that. I'm going to hand it over to Florence to kick off the conversation with, I'm sure she has some questions as well for our speakers.
Oh, always. The more data you get, the more questions you have. It's a joy of data science, right? But this was really wonderful. Thank you all for your presentations. You know, Jennifer, maybe if we could ask a couple of questions. You know, it was interesting when you showed the 50% rate. I'm like, oh my gosh, after all that hard work, only 50% of them took the AP test. Wow. So did the students in the survey give information about why they didn't feel empowered to complete the AP test? And maybe aside from technology, did they feel it may have been affected by other environmental or emotional factors?
We did have an open-ended question that obviously not everybody answered with regard to that. And it was 50% on average. But remember, when you're looking at the lower income kids, it was much, much, much higher. So what they were saying was that they didn't feel prepared. They weren't, that's not where their head was. Like they had, you know, other bigger concerns. They felt like they didn't have access to, you know, the laptop or the internet. There was a wide variety of reasons, but the one that really stood out was that they didn't think they were going to pass. They didn't think it was worth the effort to do it because they were just so demoralized.
I know, I feel the same way Valerie does. She's shaking her head. So do you know what the number usually, well, what usual is a different thing now, isn't it? Before the BC, before COVID, the new BC, as I call it. So do you know what the numbers were before COVID? Do you have any feeling for that?
That is an excellent question. And that is not data that the College Board releases. And I've tried to get it a number of different ways. So we can't really tell what it was previous to that.
Yeah.
So if anybody has access, please let me know, because that is
share your data. Yeah,
a thorn in my side. But we're hoping with access to the Infinite Campus data, which is not, you know, held by the College Board, that we'll be able to get a better handle on that part of it.
Yeah, and I guess as we proceed into the future, which is a COVID future, it appears, it'll be interesting longitudinally, I guess, to see if those numbers change, if there are interventions that can be tested and verified. And I don't know if that's something that you're hoping to be able to do more research on, or what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a number of projects here at NORC on that exact same thing. So like high dose tutoring and accelerated learning, you know, everybody in the education space is working pretty hard and, you know, in lockstep trying to fix this big problem.
Yeah,
it's always been a problem, right? So I'm not like it's always been a problem.
Yeah.
This just was made much, much worse.
Yeah, it has. And it's like, you know, since a lot of us in academia, these are like our children. This is all of our children, and we're talking about these students, right? So we really care. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and these are the high school students that are coming up into, you know, university or not now. So
right.
Yeah.
We want to welcome them. We want them to feel good, and we want them to be empowered, and we want them to feel educated and prepared. So this is really interesting. You know, the other question that came up is, do you think the fact that many colleges became test optional during COVID could have affected these numbers? For example, many colleges no longer require the submission of an SAT or ACT. And maybe some high schools did not require Regents exams to be taken. Did this maybe affect students' mindsets that, well, you know, I don't really need to do that anymore, that's going away?
We didn't ask that question in the survey. We were focused on kind of AP classes because that's where we can get some really good data, you know, from across the country. I do know that, you know, programs like dual enrollment have been shown by the research to be very effective in getting kids that wouldn't traditionally go to college into college. It starts, you know, in high school with them taking college classes. But the problem there is that it's not universally accessible. You know, it's so that's another problem. It's getting more of kids into those kinds of programs that help them realize, like, oh, I can take college classes. Like it is for me. So yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, I know I was speaking with a young lady who wants to be an aeronautical engineer, which I happen to be. And so when my friends find them, they send them to me. Like, can you talk to them and tell them they're real people like this? I'm like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And she was on Cape Cod, and she was going to Cape Cod Community College while she was going to high school up there so that she would graduate with her associate's degree and her high school diploma. I give her wonderful, right? So you can do that. If you could do it with Cape Cod Community College, I'm thinking you do it a lot of places, but I think it would be interesting to make that more obvious to students too. Very interesting.
Yeah, and you know, I was a first generation college student myself, so I can tell you that you don't think of it doesn't even occur to you as an option unless it's kind of put in front of you multiple times and people are telling you that it's a thing that you can do.
Yep, never even occurred to me. I agree with you. I was brought up my grandparents. My grandfather was a plumber. My grandma was a cafeteria lady. I went to Princeton, but who knew that I could take college classes in high school? No clue.
Right.
We didn't even have AP tests though. That's how, like, you know, I'm a country bumpkin. But anyway, so and it can all work out. See, but that's very
Exactly.
interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, maybe there's more word we can get out about that. Very cool. So Brandon, I think we have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. So to what extent do you believe individuals' inconsistent adoption of protective behaviors was tied to sometimes inconsistent or at minimum evolving guidance from the medical community? You know, this may be different than a lack of trust in the medical community, more like confusion over best practices or suggested practices.
Well, I think that confusion could play a role. Certainly, some of our results suggest that without referring to specific behaviors, but just some of the patterns we saw with the risk perception to behavior relationship generally is it didn't seem as, although the behavioral intentions for some of these behaviors once they get out of wave 1 or wave 2 were fairly static, that still there was remaining uncertainty over time. It wasn't as if people seemed to say, okay, now we understand what's going on. There certainly, in terms of within, across individual differences, there were things like political polarization and so forth that did play a role, and we're continuing to explore those. We have not yet obtained a set of state level policy indices to try and explore how that variability might have affected things, because the last time we checked, the people who've been doing that have not been covering the entire range of our 6 waves. But we're hoping to do that to see if then we can control for some of the uncertainty at the policy level as we switch back and forth, and see if we can, even with our relatively gross measurement, just 6 waves, whether we can see some effect there.
Very interesting. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing your perspective. Amit and Valerie, we have a couple of questions for you, if that's okay. Did your study take into account tweets engagement rates, not just the original post, but how popular a post was and the ratio of comments and retweets?
No, we did not do that. We of course worried about bots. That's something you want to be concerned about, but haven't done that deeper dive into that. We did look at some other issues like the age group things that Natalie was talking about, but not the engagement rate stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting from an age group perspective. The younger generation can be more active, but like I have some like older relatives who have like nothing else to do, and they're on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn all day. Starting at 3:30 in the morning when they can't sleep through the night, and then all the way through the day. So it's interesting what's happening with social media, isn't it?
Let me make one point though. There is a periodicity thing that we ought to be worried about. Rate fluctuations having to do with time of day, rate fluctuations having to do with day of the week, seasons, and that's why I pointed out that holiday burst that we saw there. So we do think that there are clues in the signal that are important to tease out.
Totally agree. Another question, it would be interesting to compare the trends that you observed across social media platforms. Would you expect similar results, for example, outside of Twitter, like in Instagram or TikTok? It may be difficult to access those data sets, but...
That's the problem. And where we have looked at these issues is Reddit. Now, the problem with Reddit is that you don't get the location data. Sorry about my birds in the background, guys. You don't get the location data. And so that is, a reason that we haven't really delved into that, but we have done some mental health stuff, looking at Reddit posts.
Very interesting. So that's your bird in the background?
I'm sorry.
I thought maybe your dog had a toy. Wow.
No.
If you could teach your bird real words, they could present the next time with you, maybe.
They
seem to be rather loquacious. Very cute. Natalie, very interesting work. I love the clarity of the way you presented it. You spoke to my brain, so thank you.
Thanks, good.
Which might be scary, but it was good for me. But an overlap kind of between Valerie and Amit and Natalie's presentations. If the average Twitter user skews young and younger Americans are more likely to be negatively affected by the pandemic, can we expect to see elevated rates of anxiety or depressive behaviors expressed in social media relative to the overall average population?
Interesting. So, there may be some bias. I would, as you had alluded to, though, as far as with social media, older adults are on social media and more, and particularly with the pandemic and the move to, M Health, we've seen even more shift. And so there may be some bias, absolutely, by age, but I don't know that it's as great as we often perceive it to be. I think we've got some stereotypes in there. But yeah, again, in thinking about our older adults, although on average within the data I have, as well as some other big data sets, we generally have seen the same pattern. That's not to say that there aren't older adults that are displaying sort of similar levels of negative consequence. Within ours, we were recruiting people through Qualtrics who one could argue are probably healthier older adults, right? And may not necessarily be as representative of the entirety of the older adult population. And we're not getting into the oldest old either. We went up to 85, but really on the whole, we're sort of younger old adults. And so there absolutely, I think, is going to be nuance in there. We don't have it within our data set to get into that, but others, thinking about independence of older adults living and those in more assisted living. I think there's going to be a huge amount of variability as far as thinking about mental health consequences.
Yeah, I agree. And we have so many more years to think about this, interestingly, right? I know. The good news, the bad news. Valerie, did you have any other further comments you wanted to make, or
Well, I am intrigued by the age group things, and we didn't get to talk about it, but we have separated out the tweets by age group. And we're finding something puzzling, and we're not sure what it means yet, which is part of why we didn't talk about it. First of all, you can analyze, you can use NLP programs to identify age groups automatically. So we don't need people to declare their age. You could just look at the languages they're using and bin them. But what we were finding is a kind of a compensatory response. Now, this is really localized to the beginning phases of the pandemic. And as we've all been saying, this is really a time sensitive issue. We need to pay attention to that. But they compensate. They tell us about all the music that they're listening to and the music that they're finding on the web, and all that stuff, the movies they're watching. And we just don't believe it. Is the bottom line. We think that's an initial compensatory response, but that really does raise questions about how you interpret what it is that people are saying in social media regarding their mental health.
Very interesting. Yeah. And then one of you was presenting, and I think maybe it was Valerie on your slide, one of your getaway slides is what we used to call them, toward the end, where you were saying that this could be interesting for policymakers, the results of your study. Have you had a chance to package it for them and discuss it with any of them yet?
No, and we need to do the time series analyses and we need to pull in some people who do causal reasoning, as Natalie talked about. There are multiple confounding predictors here that you need to pull out, and before you can confidently assert, some kind of causality. But in general, in a variety of domains that I'm looking at, response to intervention is a key heuristic, scientific heuristic and policy heuristic. And in order to evaluate that, you really need, in my opinion, the big data methods that our approach is providing. At least that'll help make progress on that and complement the more traditional methods that we have also in our toolkit.
Very interesting. One of the things, while you were talking about the big data methods that are being used in some cases, we actually had a high school student who wanted to volunteer with us at the COVID Info Commons last year. God bless them. I love when these high school juniors say, can we do more of this? Like, sure, you'll be dealing with the next pandemic. God bless you. And we actually had them do a little presentation looking through the COVID Info Commons on the use of data science tools and techniques, for COVID-related research. And so what you're making me think is that maybe there's an opportunity to kind of do another run at that now that we have more awards in there, and now that the researchers had a chance to do the research and apply these new tools and techniques. One of the ones that was first presented on the KIC webinar series was actually from UCSD, and I see Chaitan's here from UCSD. I think it was Michael Pisani and one of his students, and his student actually won second place in the Student COVID Information Commons Challenge on explainable AI, related to, GGO and images and ground glass opacity images. So very interesting as you bring that up, since we're big data hubs that sponsor this, that might be another interesting angle for us to take into the future. We're actually planning our first annual COVID Info Commons. It was going to be an in-person workshop. We're not going to go there yet, so it's going to be virtual. And we're planning that for later this year. And we're going to start doing a community survey to say, so what topics would you like, and would you want to present, or what type of panel would you like to see? What could we figure out together? And I'm wondering if data science tools and techniques in COVID related research would be interesting, or if it's just so wide. I don't know. Do any of you have an opinion about that? If that would be an interesting topic?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Okay,
two thumbs up. I mean, we're even using it in looking at the student information system data because it is so large, and things like trying to figure out course names because they vary from district to district. We're using NLP and some machine learning techniques to be like, okay, we think all these different words all mean algebra 2, something like that. So I think everybody's using it in one way or another. It would be super, super nice to know what other people are doing.
Cool. Well, then we can add that to the potential list in our survey, Lauren. We're coming up with a list of which of these are the multiple choice. Which of these do you like, or come up with your own, because we're thinking of doing it like the end of the year, November, December. Very helpful. We have another question that just came in the chat. For the first presenter, which I think was Jennifer, why only focus on STEM? Do you believe results would be different or similar with other subjects? Interesting question.
Well, we focused on STEM because that was what the NSF was most interested in. But I anticipate, and I think, from some of the other research in the field, it's where we have the most reliable data in terms of, achievement and trying to look at gaps. So it's kind of like the low-hanging fruit. It is going to be possible to look at other subjects as well once we finish kind of getting all of this data from Infinite Campus. I think that will maybe be our next grant, is to go back and expand into other grades and other subjects.
Very interesting. Do you think that will be COVID related, or the new normal, which is COVID, or it'll just be generic, or how do you think you would approach it? I mean, you don't have to promise anything. I'm just saying, what are you thinking today?
Well, I think I would want to take a similar approach in looking at trajectories of learning and how they were disrupted by COVID, and specifically for the students who have fewer resources and less opportunity historically.
Very interesting. It's very helpful. Thank you. We're excited to hear you thinking about that already.
I'll come back when I have the data.
Well, good. And we'll be right here. Or, unless we'll be 3D and in virtual reality, and you'll be sitting right here in my room with me. That's what I look forward to in education. I don't know, we'll get there. We'll see. I want to have Shakespeare walking around, the kitchen with me or something. So for the third presenter, which Valerie and Ahmet, I think that would be you. I love your SQI, if you could talk about that a little bit more, but that's not what they're saying. But how do you think the SQI findings might be different in populations not on social media, either without access, low-tech literacy, or for whatever other reason?
Yeah, and that's the validation question that we really do need to work on. The problem is that the data that we would get, and I can't remember the association that provides this stuff about rates of, mental health visits and clinical visits and things like that, are so far lagged that it's impossible to do the correlation. We've done this kind of correlation between drug abuse discussion in social media and access to drug abuse counselors. And I know those correlations look pretty good, but of course that was a different domain. So I really don't know. In any case, I certainly wouldn't expect a perfect correlation. I would imagine there's some sampling biases because of the reliance on social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not unrelated to the age group questions that we were talking about before, are there biases in the data that we're getting, by age group because of the methods that we're using? But I guess what I would say about this is that there's no such thing as a perfect method, right? Every data collection method has a bias. And so what we really need to be working on is convergent evidence, or what the ethnographers would call, triangulation. That's really the answer here. So I don't think, our methods are the only methods. I think it's part of the toolkit.
My book. Yeah. Sorry, I was writing in my book in front of everybody's face. Okay, very interesting. I agree. Now, regarding your SQI, are you, did you discover that? Did you create that? Is it used elsewhere?
It is a new measure, so it's not a validated measure. And I hope I was clear that is the case, although we sure like that correlation with the holidays. That made me very happy in a certain sort of macabre sense. But the idea of mining the mental health resources, the DSM and the DAO and things like that, we have done that before in many publications, actually. I think mostly we've used Reddit data sources for those kinds of analyses. So it's certainly not the first time that we've tried to do this. But I do want to make a point, if I could, about the role of data science in this whole enterprise and emphasize what I think our main contribution is substantively, which is that because we do knowledge-based analyses, we can address the problem that Jennifer raised about the various names for the same kinds of concepts. That really is the conceptual advantage that we're providing over some of the other deep learning, machine learning techniques that are also out there doing, NLP type research and type problems.
Very interesting. Thank you. Well, this has really been great. I always learned so much. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insights. And thank you everybody for your interest and your questions. Are there any other questions that we can take in the last few minutes? Or comments? We take questions and answers. We love answers. Okay, good. Well, then I think we're all set. It was really been such a pleasure being with all of you. And thank you for sharing your insights. Thank you everyone who participated. And Lauren, any last questions or comments before we go?
No, I just wanted to say the same. Thank you to all of our speakers for these really great presentations. The research is fascinating and we're looking forward to hearing even more.
Absolutely. And keep in touch. We will be doing another one of these next month. And then you'll hear more about the workshop planned for the end of the year. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.